This is the iPhone 4S lens replacement video. I'm going to give this one a difficulty 4 out of 10, and most of this is based on the size of the screws that are inside. There's nothing too difficult about this repair, but you've got to have a steady hand and good vision. This is a phone that obviously has been repaired once before, had a custom lens installed, and was broken again. So we'll start here by removing the two pentalobe screws on the bottom of the case. And once you get those out, you can flip it over. Of course, remove your SIM card tray. Always do that before you open up the phone. Save yourself some headaches. If you go to pull the board and you have the SIM card tray in there, it is not going to come out. So from here, we just kind of push upward on the sides, slide the rear panel up, and it pops right out. And from here, the next step is going to be to disconnect the battery terminal. So we'll have a screw on either side of the terminal, unlike the 4, which only had a single screw. We've got two different screws here. And then we're going to take our pry tool and go right underneath here and just pull straight up towards us. And I don't mean up as in towards the top of the phone, but up as in away from the table. And you'll see that the little antenna wire piece that goes behind the antenna wire actually popped out of this one. So keep in mind exactly where that's going to go when we put it back together. And that just holds the antenna wire in so it doesn't come unplugged. And now that we've got the terminal released, we can go ahead and pry under the battery. You may have to apply some heat. This one came out pretty easy because it's been removed before. And once we get the battery out, I like to peel this little tab over here. That's intended to help you remove the battery, but it doesn't ever work that way. It usually just tears off. So I like to get that out of my way. And then we've got two screws that are holding this retaining bracket that goes over the main charging port flex. The main charging flex. So go ahead and remove those screws, and then we can actually pry this straight up again towards us and release that little pop connector, and then very carefully peel this back. If you find resistance on that cable, make sure to heat it up so that you don't tear anything. And up here at the top, we're going to have 5 screws that hold the EMI shield in place. So these are all different screws. Make sure you keep these in order. You don't want to mix any of this stuff up. It's a little tricky to figure out where everything goes if you don't know for sure. That screw in particular right here that I'm working on, make sure you apply a slight downwards pressure as you release it. It likes to get stuck and take the entire anchor that's underneath it along with it. So from here, what we're going to do is go behind the flex cables very carefully, and I can't stress that enough, and we need to pry this little bracket downwards with a flathead screwdriver. Once we remove that bracket, it'll kind of pop out, and these two tabs underneath kind of slide into the cover on the logic board. We're going to go ahead and disconnect the antenna at this point, and then just kind of remove that. It's routed through a little metal bracket there at the bottom to keep it in place. I like to pull the antenna wire down so that it's kind of out of the way and doesn't snag on anything when we go to pull the board out. From here, you can actually remove the disconnect the LCD and lens pop connectors, and then we can also go ahead and remove the camera, and that's held in with another pop connector. And now we've got a screw here that goes over our antenna wire at the very top. And this is like a double screw, basically a screw inside of a screw. So once you remove that one, you can pull this little retaining clip out here, and that helps keep your antenna wire plugged in at the top. And then you'll see there's actually another screw underneath there and an antenna connector right here. Watch out for that little white chip. You don't want to damage that as you're twisting and turning inside there or prying. So go ahead and pop the antenna wire off very carefully. And I had to get a better pry tool. So once we pull that up, make sure it's just kind of clear. These are flex cables, so they are made to be flexible. You don't want to put a lot of tension on them. You definitely don't want to cut or scratch them, or they will no longer work. So be really careful with these. I like to bend these back and just kind of stick them on the adhesive just very lightly so they stay out of the way. And then you can see I'm removing the board from the lower left-hand, screw from the lower left-hand side of the board. One right from the center, which will usually have a warranty sticker covering it. And then we're going to go with these two that actually go into the housing, and you can release them with a flathead screwdriver. It's kind of a funny design, but these are the ones that are a screw that goes into the housing, and then another screw goes into them afterwards to hold the antenna wires in place. So these you can usually release with a flathead. You might have to start when you put them back in with a Phillips driver. And this is a hidden screw up here at the top left-hand side of the board. Make sure you remove this tape, because underneath it you'll see that there is another screw, and if you do not remove this screw, you can damage the phone. You see that right there, and there's a little gold piece that goes right underneath it, and that actually makes contact with the camera assembly. So make sure, be absolutely certain you get this screw out. If you start pulling on the board and you don't remove that screw, you can crack the PCB board, and once you do that, you'll be lucky if your phone works at all. So this is very important. There is another hidden screw up the top left-hand corner here, and I'm taking the sticker off of this right now. This covers one of the screws for the LCD frame, so you make sure you get that exposed as well. Once you do this, you can actually pull the board out. This little rubber piece at the top is there for a reason. It keeps the LCD cable from getting cut, so make sure you don't lose that. Now down here on the charging port, we're going to have a screw on either side. On the left-hand side, you'll have a little triangular piece that fits. It's hard to describe, but there's only one place it can go, and you'll see when you take it apart. And I'm pulling it out here. There's only it's just a little corner there, and that goes right underneath the buzzer, so make sure you do not lose track of that. You need that later on. Pull this straight out, and be very careful with these metal tabs on the bottom. If you damage them, you may have some Wi-Fi or reception problems, signal problems. I'm heating up the buzzer now. There's quite a bit of adhesive underneath this, which is a good idea because it tends to vibrate loose, like on the 4s when they had it at the top corner. So this one's nice and snug, sturdy in here. I go underneath that, set it aside as is. There's only one place it can go back in. It's very difficult to lose your place. Now we've got our side screws and our corner screws. There are 3 screws down each side that have a washer. You can see there the liquid damage indicator. This phone has been wet, like the majority of iPhones that you'll work on. And then in each corner of the phone, we have a very small screw. So we're going to start by removing these side screws. Again, they have a washer underneath them, and that's what grips the footing that goes through the housing to hold the LCD into place. So make sure you don't lose the washers. Don't lose the screws. These are interchangeable, those 6 on the side, and then the 4 that are in the corners are interchangeable with each other. So it's very difficult to mix these up. You shouldn't have too much trouble if you throw them all in a pile. Just make sure that when you're taking the corner screws out that you're taking them from the very corner. A lot of people get confused and they take out the power button screw or the volume flex cable screws, and you don't want to do that. Sometimes they're kind of tricky to get back in. And this screw right here is usually the most difficult one. I got lucky taking that one out, but a lot of times you'll have to fool around with it a little bit to get the screwdriver into the right position to remove it. That's the one that's up there by the headset jack. And now I'm just going to kind of stick that cable onto the back. On the 4S, the home button actually remains with the LCD. So this is one of the cases where you actually do the opposite. We do not tape off the button with paper or anything else. We just go ahead and put the adhesive tape right over the entire front half of the phone. So we're going to take the home button off with the front assembly. It's all one piece until we begin taking it apart after disassembly. So from here, I like to heat up. The majority of, basically all of the adhesive is on the top and the bottom, right under the colored stripes. Don't worry about the edges of the phone. There is no adhesive there. It's all strictly at the top and the bottom. So once we get that nice and warm, you can usually flip the phone over and kind of put a little pressure on these footings on the inside, which will push the, oh, it looks like I forgot a screw there. Got ahead of myself. So it will actually put some pressure on these little legs that come through. It looks like I forgot 3 screws. Okay, so once again, we're going to heat up the top and the bottom. And from here, what I usually do is put a little bit of pressure on these metal footings that are going through the housing. If you can't get these to release the lens on the front, you can use a blade to kind of pry it away a little bit. But usually if you put a little bit of pressure on those, you'll get enough of a gap here that you can get inside there with the pry tool. And this, you see I took the blade this time, just kind of got it started a little bit. And once you do that, just work along the sides with a very shallow pry, top and bottom before you pull anything out. And make sure you've separated the lens from the housing where that adhesive is stuck together. And then you can route these cables through and the whole thing will release in one piece. And there we go. Remember, we have to preserve our home button. This is going to go on to the new lens LCD assembly. We're also going to salvage the pads from the 2 pop connectors on the lens and LCD flex. And then we also want to make sure that we have the camera the front-facing camera has a little plastic piece. This one is missing that, but this little black rubber piece has to come off, as well as the mesh that goes underneath the earpiece, and then also the little plastic piece. So you see I'm pointing out that the mesh is actually still on the frame on this phone because it has been disassembled before. And what I'm going to do now is just pry off this old adhesive, which usually will have some glass stuck to it wherever the phone was broken. So we're going to start with new adhesive on this one, at least on the bottom. I think we did on the top also. But if there's no broken glass and the adhesive still feels tacky, you can actually go ahead and reuse it once or twice. Just be absolutely certain you don't have anything stuck to it. Like a little shard of glass can ruin your day. If you apply too much pressure, you can actually break the new lens. So if you want to play it safe, just go ahead and remove all this old adhesive, and we'll start with a new fresh adhesive. And right here, what we have is I'm demonstrating how to remove the little plastic piece that I didn't actually have to remove off the other one. This goes around the front-facing camera. So make sure if you have an original lens, you want to go ahead and take that off, and then it will go right over the camera. And there's only one way you can really install it. It doesn't sit in there in just any direction. You have to make sure you have everything lined up properly, but you'll see what I mean when you go to put it together. It's kind of like a puzzle, and that will protect the camera from getting dusty and dirty over time, as well as will the new adhesive that we install. So now we're going to take the old home button along with this little rubber piece that we pulled off the original lens, or the previous lens, put it on the new one, and make sure that it's square. Make sure it lines up straight, because there's nothing more annoying than having a crooked home button because of that little square that they printed on it. And you can see now what I'm going to do is go ahead and heat up the old lens, and we need to peel off this little rubber gasket is the best term I can think of to call it. This is very important. If you do not install this in a 4S, more than likely your sensor will no longer work. So when you put the phone up to your face, you'll start ghost dialing people, hang up on them, pressing random buttons. So be sure that you preserve this little rubber gasket. It is even more crucial when it comes to the light colored lenses, especially the white ones, because of the way that they reflect light. You want to be absolutely certain you have that gasket. And if you have someone bringing a phone that says that the screen doesn't go into standby when they make a phone call, more than likely whoever repaired it last did not include that little rubber gasket. So here I'm just basically taking out the parts of the adhesive that we don't use. They have a couple little squares that are cut there so that light or something can get through. And go ahead and take these. As you can see, they're very nice. They're made for the phone. So it makes your life much easier than having to do hand-cut adhesive like you will have to on some phones. And especially when it comes to the top, because you can see how intricate the design is for the sticky part of this. And I cut through this usually with a pair of scissors just to make it easy, rather than doing all this in one shot. If you do it one half at a time, make your life a lot easier. And again, we have these little gaps that we have to cut out. On this one, I'm going to leave that little square in there because on the 4S, it actually has you don't need to remove that because that's all one solid metal piece up in the top right hand corner there. So just kind of try to leave that square in if you can. The more adhesive that you have, the better. It doesn't have to be 100% coverage, but we like to keep it as close to original as possible. And this is a little part that wraps around the front facing camera and the sensor. And then we have this little tiny piece that goes right underneath the earpiece. And from there, we'll go ahead and start removing these little parts so that we can stick the new lens on. So be sure that you get all this wax paper off, as well as the little red or whatever color sticker it might be that comes with your new lens. You can see right behind what I'm doing there, that red piece of plastic has to come off the phone. If it doesn't, you're not going to be able to push the lens into position and wonder why it's sticking. And again, if you ever feel like it's you're having trouble installing the lens, don't force it. A lot of times those little legs don't line up properly, so you might have to adjust them slightly. And in the worst case scenario, if you have something trapped under the LCD, if you apply pressure, you will break it, so you'll have to buy another one. So be very careful when you install these. You shouldn't have to use much force at all. Just make sure that you route your cables properly and that all those little legs on the side line up. And if you do that, it should end up looking like new. So right here you have to push down a little bit. You can see I did with my left forefinger to get that little loop to clear the housing, which there's a good way to test for this. As soon as we get this all lined up, and just kind of work your way around the edges, make sure everything sits flush. And when we finish up, these two cables at the top should match up evenly. If they do not, then you've done something wrong. More than likely, you've got one of them trapped behind, pinched behind the housing, and you don't want that to happen, so be very careful with that part. And make sure that they do line up. And what we're going to do now is go ahead and start installing our screws. I'm going to magnetize it. This really helps if you magnetize the heck out of your screwdriver. It'll make these screws stay in position because they are very small, as you can see, and they like to travel. So if I remember correctly, this must not have been the one. Occasionally you'll have a screw that doesn't want to go in properly, and you might have to take an ice pick or another object with a small end where you can kind of line them up. For some reason, these footings don't always line up with the threaded holes in the frame. So don't force anything. Do not cross thread. If you feel like something's going in sideways, back it out immediately and try to restart it and see if you can't get it to line up. You don't want to cross thread these. Once they go in, they start to strip or they won't hold, and then you just basically lost functionality of what they are designed to do, which is to hold the LCD in place. Okay, so once we've got all our screws into position, we're going to go ahead and put the buzzer back into the bottom of the phone here. You can see where that sits, and those little springs actually make contact with the logic board. So when you take that out, be really careful with it. And the charging port, this piece right here, you want to go in top first and be very careful with those little metal pins at those little metal contacts at the top. They like to get stuck on top of the frame, and if you push down, they snap off very easily. So be really careful when you install this piece. If you end up having Wi-Fi or signal issues afterwards, this is probably the reason why. In fact, more common to have signal problems if you damage this component. So if you can't pick up a good signal, you might have to replace that piece. Now, once we have these cables moved out of the way, antenna wires out of the way, we can go ahead and put the board in top half first. It should go under a little ledge at the top there, so make sure that's going to be able to sit down flush, and be very careful again with these cables, and don't pinch anything, including your antenna wire at the bottom. And if it doesn't seat properly, I would pull it out and just start over. You kind of have to get a feel for it, but there's a little deal at the top that the very top of the logic board goes underneath, and then it just kind of pushes in at the bottom. You shouldn't have to apply force, and it shouldn't feel real spongy, like it's pushing back against you. If it does, you're probably doing something wrong, so just pull it out, make sure there's nothing in the way, and start over. Now these, I'm working on the little screws with the crosshair. I don't even know what to call them at this point, but if you start with the crosshair first and then you go to your slotted, you can get enough torque to get them tightened down. And you want to tighten these down pretty decent, a little beyond what I call finger tightening, because if you go to remove the screws that go into these and they're not tightened down, you'll unscrew the whole thing, and then you kind of have a mess. You have a screw stuck to the board basically. So on those two, I would recommend applying a little more force than normal. Not a whole lot of force. It's not a lug nut. Okay, so this is the fun part, and that is getting the antenna wire plugged in. A lot of people struggle with this, myself included on occasion. But after you get a little practice, just be very careful. You don't want to force those. You don't want to force any of these connections. If you apply too much pressure, you can damage them. So you just want to make sure that they are lined up properly. If they are, they'll snap right into place. If they aren't, you'll feel like you're pushing down and it's not locking in, and you're probably putting a lot of pressure on those little connections, and they are very sensitive. So again, on the antenna wires and the pop connectors, never apply a lot of pressure. You can definitely do a lot of damage. And if you damage it on the board, there's, in many cases, no way to repair it. So just extreme caution and a lot of practice are the best things I can recommend for those types of connections. It seems to be one point that a lot of people get hung up on. And I'm going to go ahead and put that little sticker over the hidden screw just because, or maybe I'm not. I think that one finally just wore out. So we need to put this little piece at the top corner. Remember, this is for the camera, and it goes on to right underneath the hidden screw on the top left-hand side. So you can have to manipulate this to get into position. Tweezers come in really handy for this, especially the non-magnetic type, because then nothing sticks to them. And we'll go ahead and put the screw back in. And from here, I'm basically going to install the camera. And once we cover up that little screw, and from here we can start plugging everything in: the lens, the LCD, the 3 flex cables on the left hand side. And again, be very careful with these. They are very sensitive and you don't want to force them either. But if you cut one of these cables or scratch it, your life is going to become very complicated, because replacing the flex cables on this phone can be quite tedious. So just if you're going to break anything, make sure it's not one of these or the logic board. Those are the two things you don't want to have to replace. Okay, and then of course we have our one little antenna wire here at the top. And once we have that installed, there's this little black clip. If you remember, I kind of put it in on the left-hand side first, where it goes down between the logic board and the frame. And then we've got one little screw that goes in there. From this point, it's relatively easy, but there are a couple of things that I want to point out. Okay, so from the old lens, what we want to do is remove these little pads from both of the cables. And what these do is they put enough pressure on the pop connectors underneath the EMI shield so that if you drop your phone, the lens or LCD will not come unplugged on accident. And I've seen quite a few phones come in missing these pieces, and of course when they get dropped, the screen won't turn on and the owner can't figure out why. And the reason is because those pads were never installed. So make sure you include those. Go ahead and put your EMI shield back on, again being very careful around the flex cables. And from here, I think a little piece of the flash, one of the little covers that goes on the outside of the flash fell off while I was putting the shield on. So put that back into position, clip this into place, and from here on we're just going to install those 5 screws at the top. We will then install the battery, plug it into the battery port, put the back of the phone on, screws in the bottom, SIM card in, and we'll be ready to go. Oh, and don't forget, we have one little piece here that goes right under the battery terminal, so it actually holds the antenna connector in place. It's kind of a funny design, but a lot of people are tempted to put that on top of the battery terminal, but it actually goes underneath. Make sure you have that inside. You've got the 2 other screws that hold it into place, and then we'll put the back of the phone back on. Thanks for watching. I hope that you found this helpful. If you did, please thumbs up. And if you have any questions, post them in the comment section. I'd prefer you do that rather than directly message me. I'd like for everyone to be able to benefit from any conversations that we have about the video. And again, thanks for watching.